Good morning, everyone. We are in Perek Lamed Tet, chapter 39 of Sefer Yeshayahu. And before I forget, next week we're not going to meet only because this week is Shavuos. The Academy graduation is today. The Academy dinner is next week. And I'm not sure between all of those wonderful opportunities that I'll have enough time to prepare a wonderful Perek that deserves real preparation. So I apologize in advance. We are in chapter Lamitet, and in chapter Lamitet, what takes place here is the last step of Chizkiyahu's reign. It is actually an event that we're not 100% sure when it took place. There's a bit of a machloket between the Rishonim of when exactly it took place. And yet it is a short interlude that is fascinating in terms of its implications and in terms of what it tells us, perhaps, about Chizkiyahu. And so the way the Perek begins is with the phrase Be'etahi, at that time. Now, whenever you have Be'etahi at that time, obviously it's referencing something that happened before. The only problem of what happened before is there's a couple of things. One was a couple of prakim ago where we talked about the destruction of Ashur, of Sancheriv's army that had laid siege around Yerushalayim. The other possibility is the healing of Chizkiyahu and his prayer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All of those things. What does it relate to? So the Dat Mikra takes a very simple approach. He says, shortly after he was healed. That's it. A little bit after his healed on his Be'eta, he is referencing the immediate previous Perek, the immediate previous Psukim. At the very same time, Rashi goes into a little bit more detail. And Rashi's detail is that what happens here is not only is it at the time of his healing, but that the king of Bavel, who we're going to encounter in a minute, Merodach Baladan had a very fixed schedule. Rashi explains based on a medrash. He had a very fixed schedule in his life. He knew what time he was going to wake up. He knew what time he was going to go to sleep. He knew what time everything was. And kings in those days had that kind of fixed schedule. And all of a sudden, he wakes up from what he thought was his nap, and he finds out it's a different time than he expected. It seemed like he had overslept and gone on to the next day already. And as a result, he begins to attack his advisors, who then tell him, wait a second, there was something that happened with the sun, and the sun went back in time 10 hours, and we're really not sure what went on, but we hear that this was all related to King Chizkiyahu in Israel. And at that time, when he heard that Chizkiyahu somehow was so close to God or so powerful, at that very time, Merodach Baladan sent over messengers and ultimately would come to have people visit him, a delegation to come visit him, to see who is this amazing person. That's the simplest of approaches. It may have happened right after he was healed. It may have happened, though, a little bit later, a little later in the story. We're not really sure. And by the way, just to be specific, if they saw in Bavel, which again was part of the question we dealt with last time, if they saw in Bavel that there was a miracle that occurred with the sun, by the time they would get to Eretz Yisrael, it's not like the next day. It's a significant amount of time for them to travel from Babylonia, from Mesopotamia, over to Eretz Yisrael. You have to go up the Fertile Crescent and around and down. It's not a couple days' journey. It's a significant journey. So even though we say Be'etahi, it doesn't mean right away, no matter what you say. And at that time, Shalach Merodach Baladan ben Baladan, Melech Bavel, and therefore Merodach Baladan, the son of Baladan, and the Mefarshim will point out that in those days he took on his father's name as one of his own names. That's why his real name was Merodach, and he took on the name Baladan in honor of his father, but then you end up having the name Merodach Baladan, the son of Baladan. Okay, Melech Bavel, Sfarim u'mincha el Chizkiyahu. He sent him books. According to the Targum Yonatan, he sent him Ktav Oda Nisa Diaved Lichizkiyahu, books of praise, letters of praise over the miracle that had happened for Chizkiyahu. According to Yosef ben Mattiyahu, Josephus, he wanted to go ahead and he sent him books. These were some kind of political documents that he had sent him proposing some kind of alliance because at that time in the world, Assyria was the dominant empire. But Babylonia, was still a small little country. It hadn't risen in power, and they were subjugated to Ashur, very much like we had seen within Eretz Yisrael itself. And so he's saying, hey, you have this extraordinary power. Why don't we team up? I want to be able to accomplish something as well. According to Divrei Hayamim Beto, there's something else. And something else that's going on is Ladat Kol Bevavo. He wanted to know what's in his heart. Says Divrei Hayamim Bet, Lamed Aleph. He says, I want to know what you're thinking. And at that point, I want to know what's in your heart. Chizkiyahu is going to take a tragic misstep. Because B'chol Asher Bilvavo, what's in your heart, what should have been what is in Chizkiyahu's heart is this extraordinary gratitude to God. I want to know, what you're all about is what really he's sending. He wanted to understand what was this power, this God power that was working on behalf of the Jewish people. And unfortunately, and we see this in Yeshayahu and Bet and elsewhere, where Chizkiyahu had this opportunity now to start talking, Kimitzion Tetzei Torah, Dvar Hashem, Yerushalayim, he had this opportunity to start influencing Bavel in the service of God. He didn't take that route. And it's possible very much, according to most of the Meforshim, that he actually sinned at that very same sense. Because he heard over the fact that he had been ill and he became strengthened. At this moment, Chizkiyahu rejoiced. In Malachim Bet, the verb is Vayishma Alehem. He heard of them. Both of them work in the sense that Chizkiyahu heard that this delegation was coming, a royal delegation is on its way. The word comes out. He was very, very joyous of the fact that they're coming to visit him. Why? Because he wants, this is a tremendous kavod for another nation to come. They weren't the only ones, in fact. And we look back in Divrei Hayamim, we see that other nations had also appeared for Chizkiyahu after his success over Ashur. Vayarem et Beit Nechotam, and when they came, Chizkiyahu showed them the Beit Nechotam. Now, the Beit Nechotam, we're really not sure what that term means. There's a machloket. Okay, they simply stated Nechotah is most likely an Assyrian loanword, but it's similar to Nechaot. When we have the sale of Yosef, we have the terminology Nun Chof Aleph. It's similar. So some people say, and some of them in the Meforshim say, that what this is referring to is the storehouses of his spices. Spices in the ancient world were precious. And so he showed him some of his great wealth. The problem with it saying that the Beit Nechotah is referring to the spices is later on in this very same pasuk, when we delineate all the things he showed him ve'etap samim. He also showed him the spices. So why would that be called that? As a result, the Radak says that what this is talking about, and this is the Radak in Malachim, he says this is talking about Beit Chemdato. He showed him his treasure houses. Now, Chemda is something is beloved. So really, it's the literal translation of the word treasury. Normally think of treasury as, Fort Knox. Well, treasury is that which I treasure, which is to me the most beloved. That's why the word treasury comes from. The Department of Treasury says a lot about the United States, right? We treasure capitalism and money. In Fort Knox, in the Treasury, the Department of Treasury has no control over great art. Okay, the only thing that's treasured nowadays in the modern meaning is money. But in those days, the things that I treasured would be anything of great value to him. And that's what the Radak points out. And as he shows them, et hakesef ve'et hazahav, he shows them the silver and the gold, ve'et hapsamim, and the spices, ve'et hashemen hatov, and also the good oils, ve'et kol beit kelav, and all of the utensils, ve'et kol asher nimtza ba'otzrotav, and everything that's found in his storehouses. Lo haya davar asher lo har'em Chizkiyahu beveito. There was nothing that he didn't show off to them in Memshalto, in all of his monarchy. Now, the Medrash, by the way, picks up on this, and the Medrash picks up and says, wait a second, there's nothing that he didn't show him. So, for example, in the Targum Yonatan and Divrei Hayamim, it says that he actually took him into the Beit HaMikdash, and he opened up the Aron, and he showed him the Luchot and the Shivrei Luchot. Rashi talks about he showed him his personal Sefer Torah, which was kept the king's Sefer Torah was normally kept by his side, but when he was away, he didn't schlep it around with him. It was kept in Beit Otzar, in his place of keeping, of the storage place in that sense. Okay, he showed him all of the wealth and all of the treasures of the Jewish people. Yeah.
Action to receiving political visitors. The medrash sounds more realistic, like saying, "Hey, you want to know about my relationship with God? Here it is." And then to go to the Beis Hamikdash and you see we have this special way of doing things. And
so interestingly, what's happening here is there's two possibilities, and we'll get to that second possibility, which isn't as terrible, okay, even though we'll see from the reaction that it's not good. And that's Julius Hirsch's explanation, which I made up for you a little to look at a little bit later. But what's happening here is he is Vayismach Alehem. He rejoiced in the fact that this delegation came. Why is he rejoicing? This is a moment of his feeling that he has made it, in the sense that he was successful. People come and they want to learn from him. People come and they want to pay tribute to him. Remember, they're sending gifts also. They want to pay tribute to him. According to the majority of Chazal, despite the fact what Julius Hirsch is going to say, according to the majority of Chazal, he was out of control. At this point, Chizkiyahu says, let me show you how wonderful this country is. It's like you're taking him on a tour of everything. Look what I've been able to amass. Look at all of these great things. And by showing him the Luchot in the Sefer Torah, he violated halacha. People didn't go into the Beit HaMikdash. You're not allowed to see those kinds of things. He's opening everything up. He's showing them everything. Now, at the very same time, when he's doing this, he's also compromising his entire government. Because if you show a foreign government everything you have, you're creating one of two possibilities. And maybe both of them. One is they know what you have. And number two is they can want what you have. Meaning that Bavel can go back, the delegation go back and say, my God, there's so much gold there. You should be just there for the taking. And in fact, we'll see from these reactions. So all of these things that are taking place at this moment seem to be pretty extreme of what's of a reaction in the negative. There was nothing that he didn't show him. And at that point, okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to be upset with him. And from the reaction of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is also one of the ways, we learned about this a long time ago with David HaMelech. Remember where the Gemara says, right? Anyone who says that David sinned is only making a mistake, right? Now, the reality is I recently heard a beautiful explanation of it, that it is not David who sinned. Anyone says David, but HaMelech David. If anyone says if anyone says David sinned, what David did with Bathsheba for a commoner was not that big of a sin, but for Melech David, it would have been a massive sin. Okay, so that was Rav Lichtenstein said that actually. Rav Lichtenstein made that distinction within the terminology, because how do we know that David HaMelech sinned? Without a doubt, no matter what the Gemara said, is because Natan HaNavi comes and curses him out and says, how did you do such a thing? And gives him such musar over the top of his head for all that he did. So when you see reactions, whenever you have reactions,
but the reader, we know.
Yeah, but whenever you see a reaction within the text, you know from the reaction what the action really was. Okay, so if I see that there's a negative reaction to it, then I know that what was done was negative.
Yeah, but in that story, if you make a comparison, if in that story of David HaMelech and Bathsheba, he was trying to do his best to cover it up, so he knew it was wrong.
Yeah, but the issue we have is then Chazal say he didn't sin, right? And how do we put these two together? Now there are some people who say, well, he didn't sin, right? Barbanel is always very.
Anybody says that.
Yeah, well, we're way off topic, but remember, Abarbanel is not a great fan of monarchies. Anything to do with government, monarchy, civilization, Abarbanel was not a big fan of. And if you just consider his life, he had good reason not to be a big fan. Okay, but going back to this case, we see he shows everything. Now, when he shows everything, Vayavo Yeshayahu Hanavi. Along comes Yeshayahu, El Hamelech Chizkiyahu, to the king Chizkiyahu. Notice that in this case, all of the formalities in place. Yeshayahu the prophet comes to Chizkiyahu the king. Okay, and remember they're mishpacha. Okay, and he says, "Vayomer elav," and he says to him, "Ma'amru anashim ha'ele." What did these people say? Umi ayin yavo elecha, and where did they come from? Vayomer Chizkiyahu, and Chizkiyahu says, "Me'eretz rechoka ba'u elai mi Bavel." They came from a far-off land from Bavel. Now, when you see the kind of question like this, okay, it should immediately have all sorts of bells ringing. We have similar scenarios to this if you just think about the going back to Cain and Hevel, where God goes in and says, "Where is your brother?" Right? Whenever you have those kinds of questions are somewhat of a setup. Now, the setup is an opportunity, according to the Medrash. The Medrash in Breshit Rabbah brings this down, and Rashi quotes from a piece of that Medrash, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has Yeshayahu asking these questions so that he has an opportunity to chap that he made a mistake. Okay, there the Medrash says ultimately that Arba'ah hen shekisha Kadosh Baruch Hu al kankan. There were 4 people who HaKadosh Baruch Hu knocked on the jug. In other words, he kind of knocked on their head almost. Umatza'an kankanin shel meimer raglayim, and they found out that the jugs were filled with urine. In other words, they didn't get it. And who were they? Ve'elu en Adam ve'Kayin u'Bilam ve'Chizkiyahu. And there were the 4 people. They were Adam. Okay, and they were Cain we mentioned already, Bilam. Okay, remember HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, "Who were those people who came to visit you?" With Adam, he says, if you remember all of the issues going back to Adam with the Isha, with Vayomer Adam Isha, he says, "Who did this?" Right, and he blames it on her. And now with Chizkiyahu, each of these cases, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives them an opportunity to say something, and that's the reason for that question. The question, obviously, Yeshayahu knew what was going on. Everybody knew what was going on. The royal delegation comes from Bavel, and they don't know what's going on. And Chizkiyahu's answer here, though, was that he missed the whole point. Vayomer Chizkiyahu, I'm sorry, Vayomer Chizkiyahu me'eretz rechacha ba'u elai mi Bavel. In other words, he's saying, "Hey, this is me. I look at all the covenant I had. This was something really big for me." That's Rashi's approach. Okay, the Malbim is saying is also a 2-part piece. There are 2 questions. Who were these people? Okay. Who were these people? These people were a delegation. Did you give them the right message? And number 2 is, where'd they come from? Did you had an opportunity to spread the word of God all the way over to Mesopotamia? There are 2 things that you missed out. You didn't teach them like you should have taught them, and you didn't spread the word like you should have spread the word. Also, when you look at the very same thing, Rashi says he's Eli. It's about me. He's showing a sense of pride in what happened. Vayomer maru b'veitecha, and so he says, "What did they see in your house?" Vayomer Chizkiyahu et kol asher b'veiti ra'u ki lo haya davar asher lo yiritem be'otzrotai. They saw everything. Again, it's a setup. These questions. Now, notice here, there are no titles that are associated. When Yeshayahu first comes in, he comes in with all the pomp and circumstance of a Navi coming to visit a king, which is unusual, the Navi coming directly to the king. Now, it's person to person. Now it's a very direct kind of thing. He shows, I showed them everything. There is a side issue, by the way. If this was immediately after his sickness and immediately after the siege, where did all of this wealth come from? Now, the simplest answer in the Medrash says all this wealth came from everything that had been left behind by the Assyrians when their army had laid siege. They collected all of the wealth from those encampments. If you remember, encampments in those days were not like the encampments you have nowadays, where you bring just what you need. They brought gold and silver, so the generals and the important people would be able to live in luxury while they're laying siege. So there was perhaps all of that. It could also have been, by the way, from the gifts that the other nations had brought. Also, it sent over to Chizkiyahu. He had all this wealth. I showed him anything. Vayomer Yeshayahu el Chizkiyahu. And so Yeshayahu says to Chizkiyahu, Shema Devar Hashem Tzvakot. Now listen to what God has to say. Hinei Yamim Ba'im. The days will come. V'nisa kol asher beveitecha v'asher otzru avotecha ad hayom hazeh Bavel. Everything that is in your house, that is everything you showed them, will all be carried off into Bavel. Lo yivater davar, Amar Hashem. Nothing is going to remain. What is this? Rashi says this is a midah keneged midah. This is the absolute kind of justice back to one to the next. Lo hayad davar, he showed him there was nothing. Lo hayad davar asher lo haritim. It says in the previous passage there was nothing he didn't show him, and so as a result there is nothing that's going to remain. Says the Maharikra in his comments to Rashi. This isn't the classic Maharikra. This is, again, one of the advantages we have now with new technologies. Al HaTorah keeps on adding manuscript works and scholarly works into their collection. And so the Hagaot, the Maharikra to Rashi. So the Maharikra's notes onto Rashi, he says also, okay, when it comes, the earlier statement, "V'nisa kol asher beveitecha," that also is a comment, because what's going to happen? Everything was shown from my house. Everything from the house, everything was shown from the house, everything from the house. They saw everything. Nothing is going to be. Everything is going to be taken. That there are two steps to this process. Umi banecha, and even your children, asher yetzu mimcha, who will be born. Remember, Chizkiyahu, according to Chazal, is not married at this time, right? We know that his successor, Menashe, only takes over, is only going to be born a couple of years later. We know just from the chronology, very simply, and from your children who will come forth from you, in that kind of case, asher tolid v'ikachu, they're going to be taken. Vayu sarisim, and they will be made into sarisim. Sarisim, there's a famous machloket in the Gemara. A saris literally means a eunuch. However, sarisim later in Jewish history became just officers. Okay, originally the sarisim were the ones who were responsible for the harems, in which case it's pretty clear to say that they were eunuchs. Later on, a person who was an officer, we also use the word of saris. So it could be that these are they will be made into Sarisim Be'echal Melech Bavel, in the palace of the king of Bavel. Now, who are the children who are going to be born later on, who are going to be taken off? Well, we know they're Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Who were three people in the court who were descendants of the Davidic dynasty, offspring of Chizkiyahu, and the Abarbanel adds into this picture also Daniel and also Zerubbabel. That all of these officials from the Davidic dynasty are going to be taken ultimately from Yerushalayim, are going to be brought out into the palace. They're going to be serving the new king in some fashion, and all of them will lose out on what was. The Abarbanel asks a question. And the question is, wait a second. So Chizkiyahu got a little carried away. He got a little carried away, got a little full of himself. And he showed all this stuff. And because of that, he's going to lose everything and all of his children are going to go away. Why is it that Chizkiyahu should be punished to this extent? And so he suggests that there are actually two parts to the punishment. This first part of the punishment really doesn't describe a galut. This first part of the punishment is a direct punishment to the actions of Chizkiyahu. However, the second part of the punishment refers to them as a siba krova and a siba rechoka. Chizkiyahu set the stage in the way he behaved. He showed the Babylonians all of the riches of the Jewish people, which would then motivate them to want to conquer the Jews. It was more of a consequence. It was a punishment from God, but it was a punishment on a specific sin. The actual exile itself is going to come as a punishment for what Menashe, the next generation, is going to do. That he is the Siba Krova, Chizkiyahu is the Siba Rechoka. Now, the reason this helps out in this is if you think about it for a minute, and I'm going to go back and I don't want to lose anyone on this. We're going to say, in essence, that Chizkiyahu will be punished for his actions, but it is not going to be that ultimate punishment of destruction. It's not going to be everything. There's going to be, you're going to lose. Now, by the way, Chizkiyahu had lost all of his wealth already once to Ashur. He paid them off with everything. He had stripped the doors of the Beit HaMikdash from their gold. All of that happened. So it's not over the top of a punishment. His children being taken off, that's a pretty big punishment. But that's not going to be the ultimate destruction of the Jewish people. The ultimate destruction of the Jewish people is going to come from what follows him. And the reason that helps is as follows. Vayomer Chizkiyahu el Yeshayahu. Chizkiyahu now responds to Yeshayahu. He's heard the punishment. Tov devar Hashem asher dibarta. What God has said is good. Vayomer ki yesh shalom ve'emet biyamai. And he says, because things will be peaceful in my time. Now, taken on the simplest of levels, it sounds like Chizkiyahu says, okay, as long as I get to live well. That's what it sounds like. The Maharikra says that ultimately what you're telling me is Tov. Why? Because you told me I'm going to have children. I have a future. And you told me it's going to be peaceful. And as a result, he's kind of happy. But that's the wrong reaction. The Maharikra says what he should have done right now is beg for mercy. I made a mistake. Just like in the previous parak, I sinned. I asked for forgiveness. He should have been begging for mercy. And here he's saying, okay, it's other people's problems. I'm okay with it. And in fact, the Maharikra says the fact that he didn't ask for mercy and he didn't beg that the Jewish people be saved from what seems to be the prelude at the very least for galut, for dispersion, is the very reason why the next parak starts with the words Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. Yeshayahu says if the king is not going to request, somebody's got to say something. And so God is going to ask for mercy for the Jewish people. That's the Maharikra. And however, the Shadal goes a little differently. The Shadal says that if you look carefully in the pasuk, the Shadal is not the only one who notes this. It's very unusual in the sense that the word Vayomer appears twice in one pasuk. Vayomer Chizkiyahu el Yeshayahu tov devar Hashem. Right? Good what God said. And then Vayomer devar Hashem asher dibarta. Vayomer ki yeshalom ve'emet biyamai, because it will be peace and truth in my days. There's two parts to this statement that seem to be two completely separate statements, even though they're in a single pasuk. Otherwise, what's the Vayomer doing here? The Vayomer, whenever a Vayomer appears in the middle of a statement, there is some kind of pause, there's some kind of rejoinder, it's something that's going on. So the Shadal says that Tov Hadavar, that when he says it's Tov, just like the Malbim says, that means it's tzaddik. I get it. You gave me Musar. I accept your Musar. What you said is right. Is another way of saying Tov. Okay. And by accepting the Musar is not a statement of saying, oh, it's all good, but rather, it's not that like the Maharikra says, oh, look at all the good news I got, but rather I accept the Musar you give me, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then the second part of it, he says, if I know that it's good, ki yesh shalom ve'emet biyamai, okay, then the Malbim, I'll take the Malbim over the Shadal for a moment. He says, that means that your consequence, your punishment is off in the future. There's time still for things to change. There's still a possibility of something happening. And if right now I can request forgiveness, all the rest is later. You're giving me the time. Now, why would Chazal and why would the Achronim want so hard to turn this pasuk away from its pshat? The pshat seems to be of this story. Chizkiyahu unfortunately gotten too full of himself. He violated his mission. His mission, as described earlier in Sefer Yeshayahu, is to spread the word of Torah and of God to the entire world. And here Chizkiyahu missed an opportunity. He compromised the security of the people. All of those things are happening. God blasts him, tells him here's the punishment, and the simplest explanation is he still doesn't get it. Okay, but look at all the good stuff that I've been promised, and it's not going to happen in my time. Let someone else worry about it. That's the simplest way of approaching it. And the answer is because Chizkiyahu is a righteous king. And in fact, we say about Chizkiyahu, ultimately Chazal say about Chizkiyahu that he had the ability to be Mashiach, that he was one of the greatest kings that ever lived. And if that's the case, how does this story fit in? And so as a result, they tried to fit the story into the broader picture of Chizkiyahu, where we know Chizkiyahu's greatness, we know all of the positive things. How do you fit this one piece into it? And that's where we start changing that final pasuk, that he accepted the punishment, that he understood all of the rest. That's would explain the Malbim's approach. That, by the way, going back once again to David HaMelech, talking about the sin, where we just don't, when David HaMelech sins or when others sin, if it doesn't fit within the personality, we're trying to understand how it's possible, as opposed to just saying, he made a terrible mistake. Yeah.
Wasn't he anointed?
He was of course, he was anointed. He was a king from the Davidic dynasty. Yeah.
Mashiach is known as
Well, Mashiach is the anointed one, meaning that he's coming from the Davidic dynasty. Yeah. But he had, when they say Mashiach, they mean the Mashiach to bring around the Acharit Yamim. They mean the real Mashiach like that. Okay. So as a result of all of this, I wanted to share with you a piece that I read from Julius Hirsch. Now, Julius Hirsch, if you remember, wrote a commentary on Sefer Yeshayahu in the style of his father. And this is the commentary. I scanned it. I did a little OCR, so you have it on a single page. I sent it out also by the email last night. And what's happening here is Hirsch starts the same way we say, that the books, the Sfarim that were sent, and this is the second paragraph, the choice of the term Sfarim indicates that among the gifts were also documents of a political nature, which supports the assumption the Babylonian king sought Yehuda's help against a likely future attack by Syria. They're trying to create alliances. That works. Then Vayismach Alehem, he then takes a little bit of a turn. And if you look in the third paragraph, okay, Vayishma versus Vayismach Alehem, he was happy to have them come, as though recognition on the part of these heathens would enhance the glory of God's miraculous intervention. Julius Hirsch doesn't make the assumption that he didn't show them and didn't try to reach out to them. He takes the assumption Chizkiyahu did the right stuff, despite the fact that we saw the Meforshim who said he didn't. Okay, and then he says that the next paragraph, this naive and strange and touching act on Chizkiyahu's part, showing them everything, being a naive act, who comes with a rebuke, who must have reminded him of the biblical prohibition of not amassing silver and gold unto himself in excess. Hirsch says, why is he getting cursed out? Not for him showing everything, but the fact that you're showing everything means that you have too much, meaning you're going down the road of kings that the Torah had told us not to go down. And then it says, and this is the last piece, bringing in Divrei Yamim at the bottom, yet an earlier verse there, verse 26, is talking about Perek Lamed Bet and Divrei Yamim, notes that Chizkiyahu once grasped the seriousness of his error. Vayichna Chizkiyahu begava libo, Chizkiyahu humbled himself for the pride of his heart. Significantly, the verse continues, Hu v'yoshvei Yerushalayim, meaning that it wasn't just him, but it was also all of Yerushalayim on the second side of the page, that his noble-mindedness and the example he set were the keys to the people's faith and trust in their king. So he takes the beginning very differently. He says Chizkiyahu was high-minded, but he figured out right away what happened, and everybody else learned from him. And then he deals with the final pasuk. The final verse of the chapter conveys to us a perception of his piety, devotion, and almost superhuman magnanimity. Now, the last pasuk, the way we've explained it until now, does not sound pious, devotion, and magnanimous. It doesn't sound like it. Chizkiyahu feels deeply the prophetic revelation of the coming misfortune is rooted in his own aberration. He bows his head in remorse and contrition. At the same time, he voices his gratitude for the divine assurance that peace would be maintained during his lifetime. He even cherishes the hope that his strenuous efforts to raise the spiritual and moral quality of life among the people would help avert the threatening doom. He says, Why is he saying Tov? Well, at the very least, he's taking the approach of the Tov that belongs to the Malbim. I accept it. Thus, Chizkiah regenerated and secured God's sanctuary for all time to come. His steadfastness and loyalty to God's word earned him Yirmiyahu's historic pronouncement. He put his faith in the God of Israel. There was none like him among all the kings of Judah who came after him, nor among those who preceded him. He clung tightly to God, never strayed from his wake, and kept his commandments, which God had commanded to Moshe. Chizkiah, now, where does Yirmiyahu say this? Yirmiyahu is the author of Sefer Malachim. So Yirmiyahu Navi, who authored Sefer Malachim, talks about Chizkiyahu as being the best of the best. And Hirsch says, how do we see the best of the best? Even when he sinned, he was able to turn it around and use it as a source of encouragement for everyone else. And then he deals with the final pasuk regarding the repeated Vayomer. This is the second to the last paragraph. We believe the second Vayomer refers to God, as quoted by Chizkiyahu. Now, Hirsch takes a very difficult step. He says, if I look at this last pasuk, Vayomer Chizkiyahu Yeshayahu, Tov Devar Hashem Asher Dibarta. I accept the rebuke of God. Vayomer, and God responds, Ki yesh shalom ve'emet b'yamai, that there should be peace and justice and peace and truthfulness in my day. The reason I copied it is because if I didn't copy it, you might not accept it. We base our view on the fact that in Tanakh, words spoken by a person introduced by Yomer are never interrupted by a second Vayomer in the same verse, unless the first Vayomer is followed by a rejoinder. And he gives a quote from the Akedah. And then Hirsch gets the last paragraph. We firmly reject the notion advanced by non-Jewish exegetes who take Chizkiyahu's words as those of an egoist who is content in the knowledge of the divine judgment will spare him during his own lifetime. By the way, there are Rishonim who said this. This is not just non-Jewish exegetes. That would make it appear as though he's totally unconcerned about the future of his children and his people. If there were even a shred of truth in such an idea, it'd be absurd to assume that Chizkiyahu would immortalize such self-abusing words in a book that he himself compiled together with his assistants, because this sefer is written by Chizkiyahu and his assistants. Okay, so what Hirsch takes is a very different approach to the chapter. Hirsch's approach to this chapter is Chizkiyahu made a terrible mistake. Yeshayahu rebukes him. Chizkiyahu accepts the rebuke. I made the mistake. And he says, I accept it. And he obviously does something more. What Chizkiyahu doesn't do, even according to Hirsch, at any point is recite any prayer for forgiveness. And that's the piece which is complicated to accept from Hirsch. If he never says, forgive me, never says anything to save my children, save my monarchy, it's hard to imply that it took place. Not impossible, but harder to imply. We have two different views of the parak, but one view of Chizkiyahu. Chizkiyahu was the greatest of all the kings. Okay, that's what Yirmiyahu Navi says. No question about it. But is this a chapter of failure, or is this a chapter of failure with repentance? We're not sure. Yep.
Said that his heart was humble.
Yeah,
So
gives that piece of opening to it, but Divrei Yomim is not as forgiving either. Okay, Hirsch takes it, and really what it's coming to is, where's my starting point? And this is the difference, by the way, between the way we view Tanakh and the way those who don't believe in the greatness of Tanakh view it. You know, there was a rabbi. He had actually been the rabbi of Mikra Kodesh Anshe, Mikdash Al Hagra. He was the rabbi of Mikdash Al Hagra on Dodge many years ago, and he became a professor at JTS. Burton Vysotsky was his name. Burton Vysotsky took the approach, for example, that the Tanakh is great literature. And he wrote, there was a series on PBS, I've mentioned this many times, called Genesis, where his basic premise was based on a book he wrote. His basic premise was that the book of Genesis is a book of dysfunctional family. Okay, and that's the way he took it. And it was fascinating. Now, is there dysfunctionality? Huh? If there's dysfunctionality, there is, but it wasn't, but if there's no greatness, if I go ahead, this goes to more modern approaches, for instance, in Israel, where they talk about what's called Tanakh Ba'arba Einayim, where we talk about Arba Einayim is a way of saying face to face, 4 eyes, 2 eyes to 2 eyes, okay? And they take the Tanakh and they say, well, these are people like us. And they're people like us, and therefore they have all of their failings and everything else, and we have to view it as us, because if they aren't like us, then how do we relate to it? The problem, and this is what Nachum Leibowitz used to talk about, is we have to put they're all of the great personalities of Tanakh, we have to put them on a pedestal. The pedestal has to be high enough that we recognize their greatness, but low enough that we can touch it. If we make them into malachim, into angels, we can't learn anything from them. If we make them into regular people, we don't learn what we need to learn. There's that balance always we try to do. And that's what's happening in this parak. How do we balance the greatness that we know existed within Chizkiyahu with what seems to be a terrible misstep here? So Hirsch takes one end of the spectrum, saying he was great. That's it. He lost it for a moment, but he recovered very quickly. Other Meforshim say no, he was great. He made a mistake, never prayed for the people for forgiveness. That mistake hounded him. He wasn't able to be Mashiach. He made that mistake that was severe enough in that way, but it's still within this part of a spectrum, as opposed to saying he was terrible, he blew it all, he was nothing. We can never say that because we know that he was great. We know from Yirmiyahu, we know from all the statements of Chazal that he was great as well. The next chapter we're going to be dealing with, Perek Mem, is what is called in the non-Jewish world the work of the second Isaiah. Okay, it is. We don't believe that. We believe there was one Yeshayahu Navi. I think I mentioned last week that Rav Amital, when he was asked about a second Isaiah, where there are 2 Isaiahs, Rav Amital made the statement, "Halavai, there would have been 100 Isaiahs." Okay, but the reality is, it takes a very different tone from there till the end of the Sefer. It is all poetic and it is all words of comfort, as opposed to discussing the sections of or the history before Churban HaBayit. It's going to be addressing the people who were dispersed in Bavel and trying to find the comfort for them. It's the source of all the Haftarahs we say in the Shiva D'Nechimta of the 7 weeks between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah. It's a lot of that is going to be familiar. The division of the Prakim in the second half of Yeshayahu often don't make a lot of sense. And in fact, sometimes because of the nature of the text, we'll take pieces according to more of the Masoretic divisions of it, as opposed to parak by parak. Next week, we will not have shir, as I mentioned. The week after, we'll be going back. We'll be continuing to go on a regular basis. We have, we're a little bit past halfway. We're more than halfway through Sefer Yeshayahu, but we're now going to be entering into a new piece of the book, a Yeshayahu that seems to be talking about things that took place after Yeshayahu. We'll stop here and have a wonderful day.